welcome to the first online lecture. It's all because I'm just sitting in a room by myself talking. But we are moving into a new unit, Unit 2, and leading up to talking about the American Revolution. Alright, so the expectation, as always for Cornell Notes, is that you are putting the headings in, you're taking notes under that. You have at least 3 questions and a summary for the important stuff. Let's get started. Okay, so we're starting with talking about American Enlightenment. So we're in about the 1730s, 1740s, 1750s. There is a term called Enlightenment happening everywhere in Europe. And it's essentially trying to apply like research and science to understand more about politics and social life. And essentially there's a lower reliance on religion and instead trying to talk about reason. Like, oh, we don't need God to get people to listen to rules. Like, we'll explain to them why it makes sense for them to follow the government or to like pay taxes or not steal from each other. Pretty big deal as far as the foundation of our government goes. We'll get into that a little bit, but you'll spend more time on that in AP Gov next year. So, like everything, the ideas of Enlightenment spread to the American colonies. Even though it started in Europe, it was happening more in American colonies too, which meant there was a less reliance on religion. This dude, Benjamin Franklin, he's on your $100 bills too. He really pushed this idea that religion shouldn't be what governs human interactions with each other, and instead reason and rationality should do that. There's also less of a focus on like hereditary, which means like being passed down through a family sort of tradition. So one should not own land because your father owned land, like you should have a way to own land yourself kind of thing. Cool. A response to Enlightenment is the Great Awakening. And hence Wake Me Up Before You Go. It's definitely a religious movement. So a lot of churches, religious people in the colonies were worried about losing religious members, whether that's from people migrating further west, so moving out of like Massachusetts more towards Pennsylvania, further west, or just Enlightenment in general, making people not want to go to church as much and maybe not believe in the religious practices as much. This is started in the 1730s, and it's a movement known as the religion of the heart. What it means is like trying to appeal to the emotional side of Christianity and people's taking on Christianity in a more personal way instead of like going to church, hearing a sermon every Sunday, something like that. And it was a lot less reliance on established, created churches, and sort of you would have pop-up churches everywhere. They also moved away from the crazy Puritan ideas of like, you're going to go to hell no matter what, to saying that if you repent for your sins, or if you sin and you try to make it better, that like you'll be okay, you'll probably go to heaven kind of thing. One reason this is a pretty big deal is if you look in this picture here, it was known for having like outdoor sermons. So it was trying to be really accessible to everyone. So instead of having established church, you would have a lot of priests, preachers, whatever, traveling around and trying to establish these like outdoor churches for everyone. One of the most famous ones is George Whitefield. The Great Awakening also leads to the start of Christian religions in the U.S. Some of them are Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. And it also led to this idea of religious freedom. So there shouldn't be a government-established religion. You shouldn't have to pay taxes to a church kind of thing. Religions should be free and separated from the government in what they do. All right, moving on to less religious notes and to war. Very fun and exciting. There is a war that begins, and it starts with the U.S. So if you look in this map here, there was a place called the Ohio River Valley, a little bit like underneath Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, obviously. And in that you had the British, the French, and Native Americans all kind of interacting with each other, but it's pretty tense. The fear is that one little thing could cause them all to go against each other. They didn't really all like each other. And that exactly did happen. So English settlers were trying to move into the Ohio Valley. French soldiers were not into that, and so they started sending more French soldiers to the valley. It eventually led to some English armymen trying to take over that valley. It didn't work, and it began this massive, massive global war, not just in the U.S., massive global war between Britain, Spain, and France. But a lot of it is being fought in the Ohio River Valley in the United States. Um, so Britain had won quite a few wars, so it was increasing its like prominence in the U.S. A couple of these wars: Queen Anne's War, War of Jenkins' Ear, Lord knows why that's the name, and King George's War. So Britain was financing a lot of this through taxes and increasing their debt, but they're really fighting wars against France and Spain to try to gain more global influence. And so if you see down here, this is what the 7 Years' War was mostly fighting over in every sort of area, but a lot of the colonies are getting involved. Okay, so in 1754, the war began, the 7 Years' War. It's also known as the French Indian War in U.S. history, because the English came in trying to get rid of the French soldiers in the Ohio River Valley. One famous person in the British Army who did this is George Washington, the first president of the United States, trying to defend and take over British territory from the French. At first, it looked like Britain was going to lose. There were a lot of deaths, there were a lot of problems, not enough money. But eventually, Britain decided we're going to put a lot of money into war. Who cares if we go into debt? And kind of changed their strategy to focusing more on winning the war in the colonies here instead of winning the war in Europe. So focusing on kicking out the French in the colonies in order to win the war. And they did. So in 1763, 7 years, yeah, 7 Years' War, interesting, very interesting. The war ends, and Britain, France, and Spain signed the Peace of Paris. Britain technically won this war. So they get a lot of power and influence because they say, hey man, we had this massive global war. We're the ones who won this. We get to decide some different things. So you have quite a bit of territory being given to Great Britain. A lot of it's happening in the Caribbean areas, but you have like Florida, for example, which was French. It also was such a massive war that costed a lot of money, and it led to a financial crisis, which is pretty important when we talk about the American Revolution. So Britain went into extreme debt to try to pay to win this war. And they would eventually have to increase taxes, and they decided it makes sense for us to increase taxes on the colonies since that's where we put a lot of our effort for this war. In France, you also have them trying to increase taxes, which leads to unrest and also leads to the French Revolution. So pretty big deal with the 7 Years' War and the end, which will end with an outcome of the war. A couple of things. One, taxes, right? The war was very, very expensive. So Great Britain needed to get money to pay back what they owed because they took out a lot of money for the war. They decided taxes was the way to do it. They're going to tax the colonies. Don't forget this. That's like really, really important. Second thing, an outcome of the war. You still had some conflict between the colonies and then any sort of Native Americans in the buffer. Basically, colonists were like, we won this war, so we get to take your land. And Native Americans were like, man, we weren't really in this war. And so to kind of prevent some tension and conflict and anger and further war, the British Parliament or the British government passed the Proclamation Line of 1763, which basically said there is no colonial settlement past the Appalachian Mountains. So you see the line here? They were like, yo, y'all can't leave here. You gotta stay within this area. And the colonists were kind of pissed at that. They're like, why would we fight in this war for all this land and all this stuff, and then you're telling us we can't actually move into Native American territory? You know, so it put a lot of power in the government to decide where to settle, but the colonists themselves didn't really have a choice. Another outcome of the 7 Years' War is an increased colonial identity. So before then, you have these 13 different colonies. They're all just different, doing their own thing, living their own lives, very vastly different. In order to win the war, all the colonies had to come together. They had to. There was no way. So this is a famous sort of propaganda piece, and it was put together by Benjamin Franklin to kind of promote the Albany Plan of Union. But essentially that colonists need to work together to raise taxes, to raise the military, and to prevent sort of disputes between Native Americans and French and other colonies. And that created this idea of unity. Like, we are all 13 colonies together. We are not one individual colony. Unity is important. Just going to name that too when we're talking about the American Revolution. The last thing is the outcome, ironically, even though they might be a little mad about the wars, they were like proud to be British, right? People who were British citizens or British people were like, dang, we won this war, we're really good to go. But within the colonies, you have a lot of people who are not British citizens. You have people who were conquered over in the war, such as like French Catholics. You have a lot of Germans, Scottish, Norwegian, Scandinavian people also immigrating over themselves, and they're technically not British citizens. So you have a big mix of people who might not be extremely proud to be British. Okay, I hope you enjoy the lecture, take the notes, put subtitles on, whatever, I don't care. See you later.